welcome to another episode of Farming with Science.
Hi, I'm Julia Serpia, UF Extension Intern in Hillsborough County. Welcome to the second video in the series of equine educational videos we have created for the community. Today, Dr. Carissa Wickens is back to talk about equine nutrition. Welcome back, Dr. Wickens.
Hi, Julia. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Today, I'm going to ask you a few questions about equine nutrition.
Excellent. I really want to make sure that horse owners have some basic knowledge of feeding and nutrition for horses. Definitely a topic that is very helpful to have a better understanding of in terms of asking questions and making sure that you're providing for your horse.
I agree. So my first question is, which nutrients do horses need?
There are 6 key nutrients that the horse requires to support life and bodily functions. The 6 key categories of nutrients are water, protein, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. And I said water first, but water is really the nutrient that, the horse cannot live very long without water. All the other nutrients are key, very important for sustaining life and bodily functions, but water is something I think sometimes we tend to overlook. In terms of protein, when we think about protein requirements or protein needs of the horse, it's not so much actually the protein that's required. Horses have a requirement for amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and they're needed for muscle, tissue, they're components of enzymes and hormones. And so, yes, there's protein in terms of a requirement, but they're really needing or requiring the amino acids. Those are further broken down into what we call essential or non-essential amino acids. So essential amino acids are those amino acids that the horse requires in the diet because the body can't manufacture them itself. So hence essential. When we think about carbohydrates and fats, those 2 nutrients are very important for providing calories, providing the needed energy for the horse. Fats are more energy dense. They provide more calories than carbohydrates, but carbohydrates are a very important energy source, not only for the horse directly, but the fiber component of carbohydrates, or what we call structural carbohydrates, are also important for the bugs, for the microflora in the hindgut of the horse. They have their purpose and function in keeping things healthy in the horse. But again, fats and in terms of energy requirements, fats and carbohydrates provide those calories and that energy. Vitamins and minerals are very important in terms of metabolism. Particularly, we need the components such as calcium and phosphorus are macro minerals that are primary constituents of body tissues, particularly when we think of bone and teeth and the health of our bone and teeth in our horses. Calcium and phosphorus are very important. But again, vitamins and minerals, generally speaking, are very important key nutrients for metabolic functions. Going back to fat just briefly, as it relates back to some of the vitamins, we have fat-soluble vitamins and water-soluble vitamins. We need some fat in the horse's diet to help with the absorption and utilization of those fat-soluble vitamins. So again, another reason that fat is very important in the horse's diet.
So you mentioned water first. It seems like it's very important to the horse. Just how important is water in the diet?
So again, as I mentioned, water is essential. A horse cannot live very long without access to water. They can live a little bit longer, they can survive longer without some of the other nutrients, but water really is key for survival. On average, horses will, their water intake, they'll consume between 10 and 12 gallons of water per day. Oftentimes we will see a greater intake of water, particularly during these summer months here in Florida when the weather gets very hot and humid. We might see the horse increase their water intake related to those conditions in the environment. But also with work, or particularly when we're thinking of our mares, our brood mares that are in lactation and trying to nurse a foal, those water requirements will increase. So they might drink well above that 10 to 12 gallons per day. Water really serves two primary functions. It is very important for metabolism. It helps with the absorption of other nutrients. It also just keeps digesta moving through the GI tract. So as horses are consuming their feed, it's very important for keeping things moist and flowing through the GI tract. And also it's very important for thermoregulation. So it serves, a very important function in terms of keeping the horse cool and hydrated, especially again in our hot Florida environment.
So I think a lot of people blame protein for a lot of physical and behavior problems in the horse. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the myths around protein.
So that's a great question, Julia. And actually, there are a few myths about protein, but I think in interest of time for our interview today, I'll focus on two of the key myths that sort of surround protein and protein in the horse's diet. So the first one, as you mentioned, is actually tied to behavioral maybe concerns or issues. So it's been a long held belief that too much protein in the horse's diet makes a horse hot, or what we would consider kind of hyper or very reactive. And that, in fact, is not the case. It's not the protein in the diet. What can make horses hotter tempered or more reactive is the energy in the diet. So horses that are supplied too much energy and not utilizing those calories, not utilizing that energy, it can make them more reactive and a little bit more hyper in their personality. The protein in the diet, again, that's supplying amino acids. It can be used for energy, but it's a very inefficient form of energy for the horse. They basically take the carbon unit off of the amino acid structure and they're breaking that down for energy, but that is not efficient and that's not the primary use of protein in the body. So, for example, if we're feeding the horse more grain, or if we're feeding them a really high quality forage, for example, such as a forage like alfalfa, yes, some of those dietary ingredients are going to have a higher protein content, but they also have higher energy content. So with feeding those types of feeds, we're increasing the energy that the horse is receiving. And again, that can make the horse seem hotter in their temperament. So particularly when we think of energy concentration in the diet, if the energy is coming from sugars and starches and what we call those non-structural carbohydrates, those can again relate to reactivity in making the horse a little bit more hyper. If we can replace some of that energy source, the sugars and the starches, with fat as an energy source, we've actually seen there's some good research that demonstrates a calming effect. So we actually take that horse's attitude and kind of temper or quiet things with that horse if we replace some of that energy from carbohydrate with fat. So again, it's really more about the energy component of the diet relating to behavior, not so much the protein. So one of the examples that we like to talk about is, for example, for us in the human world, if I'm getting towards the end of my workday and I'm starting to feel a bit fatigued, a bit tired, often what I will do is I'm reaching for that caffeinated sugary beverage or maybe grabbing a candy bar. So I'm getting those calories, I'm getting that sugar rush, that energy rush, and it makes me kind of perk up and feel good and able to work for a period of time. But then we also later kind of experience that crash. But that's kind of how I equate, that sort of hyper reactivity that we might see with a high energy diet or supplying too much energy, particularly in the form of sugars, versus, maybe providing some of that energy with fat in the horse's diet. So again, definitely has an effect on their behavior. One of the other common myths regarding protein and protein requirements of horses is that exercise or work greatly increases the protein need of the horse. And so certainly horses in training will need to basically accrue some additional muscle. They do have somewhat elevated protein requirements, but they're not nearly as great as what is required for that young growing horse, or for example, for a lactating mare. Most of the time, if we're going to need to supply more energy to a working or exercising horse, we're going to increase the amount of feed that we're feeding. We're going to increase that energy concentration in the diet. And when we do that, protein comes along with it. So we're also, automatically supplying some additional protein. Some of the surveys that have been conducted throughout the United States and elsewhere have shown that many horse owners very much accidentally overfeed protein. It's very common in our industry to overfeed protein, and it just becomes wasteful. It is an expensive component of the diet, so we don't want to necessarily be wasting that protein in the diet. The horses will break down and excrete excess protein in the form of mostly urea in the urine, but then what that relates to is having more ammonia in the stall, and the horse will drink more water to help excrete that excess nitrogen in the diet. So really, it can become somewhat wasteful. So again, that's one of the other myths, that these exercising or working horses need a lot of protein in the diet. They do have a slightly elevated increase in their needs, but not to the extent that maybe some people think.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. And it's also very important that horse owners have a balanced diet for their horses, because if things are unbalanced in the diet, the horse can have many issues. So how do supplements factor into a horse's diet?
So that's another excellent question, and something that I think is becoming a little bit more daunting and more challenging for horse owners. When you pick up a supply catalog, a tack and feed store catalog, or you just walk into the feed store, you're often seeing, so many supplements that are out there on the market that you can choose from. And so I think a couple things that we should talk about. One, making sure that your base diet is providing good quality ingredients, and that you are looking especially at your forage and what nutrients your forage is providing. You can get some idea of that by working with your local county extension agent, talking with the equine nutritionist. Particularly, we can get the hay analyzed so that you can actually have a much better informed report on what nutrients your hay or your forage is providing. Then we can come in with our concentrates. We can utilize a grain or maybe another kind of supplement to help then fortify that forage and meet some additional nutrient requirements for the horse if the forage isn't quite supplying all of those nutrients. But that's something very important to keep in mind. I think, generally speaking, one of the things I would recommend is just being a very educated consumer when it comes to supplements, really doing your homework and looking very carefully at the back of those labels to look at the ingredients, making sure that any supplement you're using, are you actually seeing a difference? Is it improving something with your horse that you're looking for in that supplement? Ingredient labels, for example, there are many ingredients in a lot of these supplements, but a lot of the key ingredients that are meant to benefit the horse are often supplied in very small amounts in these supplements. And so these supplements can become a very costly way to try to balance or try to provide something in the diet that maybe you could actually supply with a higher quality forage or some really good feed ingredients as the base diet. The other thing with supplements, I think we do have to raise some caution, is that many of these supplements are not necessarily backed by scientific evidence in terms of their efficacy. A lot of them are based on anecdotal reports. And so it can look very promising, but again, we have very little research to actually provide evidence that these supplements are of benefit or are supplied in those supplements in a high enough amount that it's actually doing the horse any good, yet they are costly. And so you might be throwing some of your money away at top dressing supplements versus going back to looking really closely at your base diet. The other thing that we do have to be careful is the more you implement supplements into your feeding program, not only does that add some time and labor and certainly cost, but it can also start having some overlapping effect. And again, because we don't have a lot of science behind many of these supplements, top dressing this and top dressing that and mixing all these supplements, you may actually be diluting the nutrients in your very good feeding program Or you could even have some negative effects because some of these supplements might interfere with one another or with that base diet. So we do have to exert some caution in getting too overzealous with utilizing supplements.
Right. So while we're talking about building a good feeding program, what are some feeding management practices to avoid?
So with horses, I think one of the most important sort of faux pas, or something that we have to be very careful that we're not doing, is changing the diet or making abrupt changes to the type of forage or grain that we're feeding. Abrupt changes in the horse's diet can be very problematic. Sometimes that can lead to colic or other types of digestive upset or even more severe problems. So for example, usually what we recommend to horse owners is that we want to make any changes to the horse's diet very gradually, maybe over at least a 5 to 7 day period, maybe longer if we can. Particularly, I think we think about this a lot with grain in the diet, but also with forage. Changing the forage type for the horse too drastically or too quickly can really upset the microflora in the hindgut that are helping ferment and break down that hay or that forage. So, even switching from maybe a grass hay to a legume hay, switching from coastal Bermuda very abruptly to alfalfa or perennial peanut, the horse's digestive system hasn't seen that type of forage. And so doing that switch very gradually can really be beneficial and much safer. So again, it's not just about gradual adjustments to different grains, it's making forage adjustments gradually as well. The other thing where that comes into play, or the other time of year that comes into play, is seasonal. So, when horses, especially if horses are kept on pasture and they're consuming fresh forage that's higher in moisture content, if this is the end of the summer and we're going to transition that horse from summer pasture to having free access to hay, again, we have to be kind of careful and gradual in how we make that transition. If the horse gets pretty excited about having the hay out there and starts eating too much hay too quickly, that transition from that moist pasture forage with higher water content to that drier harvested forage, that can create some digestive upset or maybe even some impaction colic kind of problems. So making sure that they always have free access to water, fresh, clean water in the pasture, but also making those forage transitions based on season of the year as gradually as possible. I think the other thing that gets really hard is most of our horses, just by default, are in a group feeding situation, but we really talk about trying to feed horses as individuals, based on their age, their workload, some other factors, including the environment, or especially age. If we're thinking about, a senior horse versus a young growing horse, their nutrient requirements are going to be quite different. And so separating groups by age can be helpful, but also making sure that we're considering behavioral aspects of our feeding management. So we don't want any individual horse to be, aggressively pushed away from feed so that then they become a harder keeper. They're not getting the calories or the nutrients that they need. We want to avoid, overt fighting and those kinds of problems. So if we're going to group feed horses, we have to make sure we're spreading out those feed resources, giving the horses enough space to eat what they need and to get out of each other's way, and just making sure that they're getting enough feed. So I think group housing situations definitely become a challenge. They create some difficulties when we're trying to feed horses properly. So again, just making sure that you're giving them enough resources and spreading those out to reduce some of those issues.
And I think it's also important to remember that each horse is different. So each feeding style for the horse is going to be dependent on their individuality, whether they're exercising, their age, if they're pregnant. So these are very important key points to keep in mind, but also remember that each feeding program will have to be styled for that specific horse.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In general, horse owners should have basic knowledge of equine nutrition. Horses were built to continuously eat small amounts of forage throughout the day. They are a monogastric species, but are able to ferment or break down the forage they consume in their hindgut with the help of microbes. These small organisms break down the fibrous material horses eat. It is important to keep this in mind because a horse's diet should be constructed to maximize their forage intake. Every horse is different, and each feeding schedule should be customized to their individual needs. Different classes of horses will have different nutrient requirements. A maintenance horse and a race horse will have different feeding programs and different nutrient requirements. Please make sure you create a program that suits your horse's needs. For more information, check out the equine nutrition publications on the electronic data information source of UF-IFIS Extension, also known as EDIS. Check the comment section below to find some helpful links about equine nutrition. That's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you, Dr. Wickens, for taking the time to talk with us.
You're very welcome, Julia. I really appreciate the opportunity.
For additional information on this topic or any other topics we discuss in this series, please reach out to your UF-IFIS Extension office in your county. There are offices in all of the 67 counties in the state of Florida. And thank you for watching our video. We hope it was helpful to you. If you have any questions, you may reach out to Dr. Wickens at cwickens@ufl.edu. And don't forget to check out our other equine educational videos. See you next time.